Hey there, welcome to Play on Channel 3. I'm your host, Jay. I have a special fascination with video game adaptations. They have such an interesting place in our cultural history, and in the greater discussion of the relationships between media. But they don't have a great reputation, do they? When the average person thinks video game adaptation, they're either thinking, will this be the movie that breaks the video game curse? Or they're like, video game movies always suck anyway. I don't think that reputation is fair.
Video games are a difficult medium to adapt. The hurdles in doing so are innumerable and daunting. They're not impossible to jump though, and as someone who does spend a lot of his free time on analyzing these adaptations, I like to think I've studied a fair bit about what makes one work, and what it takes to make a good one. This channel is a place where I want to discuss what I've learned and share in that journey for not only what future filmmakers and companies should take note of when it's their turn at the bat, but also to recognize what those of the past have already accomplished.
Let's start, and let's learn by example. Let's talk about Mega Man.
Mega Man is a video game franchise created by Capcom, famously inspired by Astro Boy. It follows a young robot named Mega Man, or Rockman in Japan, as he foils the villainous schemes of Dr. Albert W. Wily. Mega Man is supported by his creator, Dr. Thomas Light, his sister Roll, and his support unit Dog Rush, as he faces off against other robot masters working for Dr. Wily. The cartoon Mega Man, made by Ruby Spears Productions, is a 1994 Saturday morning TV show based on the first 5 games of the franchise, adapting the backstory outlined therein and featuring most of their characters. The show otherwise doesn't follow the plot of any specific individual title, nor the overarching plot of the games, aside from maybe the first in its pilot episode. I want to take a closer look at how the showrunners went about the adaptation of the plot, and to do that, I want to set a clear baseline for what the creators had to work with. This is important because when you judge an adaptation, it's not fair to judge it on the basis of material that either wasn't available to the production team or straight up didn't exist yet. For example, it doesn't make sense to judge the Super Mario Bros. Super Show for getting Princess Peach's name wrong, because she didn't have the name Princess Peach until 1996. According to an unverified interview with producer Joe Ruby, Capcom sent the team copies of the first 6 games and character art. The importance of this is that the plot of the Mega Man games is told through tiny cutscenes, the manuals, and most importantly, the gameplay. While the latter half of the original 6 games do have proper narratives that the player experiences, those narratives are there for the function of the game. As in, they're just the excuses for the game to happen with a new set of robot masters and a new scheme from Dr. Wily that we, as Mega Man, have to stop. In this way, the setup of each episode of the show is in its own way a micro version of each of the games, every episode featuring a new villainous scheme to stop and a new batch of robot masters supplanting that scheme. In scope, each episode is somewhere between a stage of a Mega Man game, where you have 1 robot master in specific to consider, and a whole game, which features 6 total robot masters in its first installment, and 8 per game from then on. This creates a classic superhero show setup, which makes sense considering the game's own influences. That makes the structure of the show a clean translation of the games to the small screen, taking the characters and premise and building a new story from scratch.
I'm going to focus on the adaptation of the main characters first, because I want to introduce and explain the ways you might go about adapting a video game character into a TV show. That said, since there's no sources on this aspect of the production, a lot of this is my theory on how they went about it, based on the interview with Joe Ruby, and working backwards from the show itself.
Dr. Light in his original incarnation is a well-intentioned, kind-hearted scientist who wants to create a world where humans and robots live side by side. He doesn't always make the right decisions, especially not design decisions, but he's altruistic and believes in redemption. This is why he, throughout the games, gives Dr. Wily countless chances to change his mind. This is probably the easiest character to start with, because while he's prominent in the source material, he is a non-playable character that does not directly contribute to gameplay as a function the player can use, nor as an enemy the player is tasked to fight. His participation is limited to between stages and to the paratextual material, as in the manuals. This means gameplay is not a factor when it comes to reworking this character in a non-interactive medium. Thanks to that, Dr. Light has more or less taken whole cloth from the games and plopped right into the cartoon, albeit with some differences to account for the new story. Firstly, his altruism is a bit more limited in the cartoon than it is in the games. While there is a time where he believes in the goodness in Proto Man's programming, he's not so keen to forgive Dr. Wily as he is in the games. The one time they work together post-villainy in the show, Dr. Light is clearly suspicious of him the entire time. He also has no particular arc, in that he's already achieved his game counterpart's goals. In the cartoon world of Mega Man, he's already created a world where humans and robots live side by side, at least in that we meet robots with full personalities that aren't robot masters and work alongside their human counterparts. It's still a new type of tech, and there are detractors to the idea, but there's nothing more to do now. For most of the show, his new ideas involve adding more robots to various aspects of society, like how we see him create a robot university.
I am very proud to announce the grand opening of your new institution of higher learning, Light University.
Honestly, I'm more charitable towards this concept than I've seen other people be, so I'll just say it's fine and move on.
Things get a bit trickier when we start to talk about characters that do contribute to gameplay. On one hand, gameplay gives you more to work with. The way a character is programmed to respond to the player, and the environment in which you meet them, says a lot about that character, especially in the case of the Mega Man series. But in the case of older games, you also might not have direct characterization to work with, which means anything you come up with for this character is purely interpretation, and may not be what the fans see or what the original creators intended. Direct characterization is when the audience is told flat-out information about a character. Implicit characterization is what the audience learns about them through their actions, dialogue, and expression. While most of the Robot Masters from Mega Man 1 through 5 feature in the show, there are two in particular that we see in every episode besides the enigmatic Proto-Man, those being Cutman and Gutsman.
When I say you don't have direct characterization, I mean that there's no personality profile in any of the material available to the production team. Remember, we're working with just the NES games and their manuals. We have no dialogue to draw from, and they aren't active agents to the plot itself since they work for Dr. Wily. But we do still have the gameplay.
Taking Cutman first, as most first-time players of Mega Man often do, his little animation when you select his stage is a threat display of sorts, slamming his fists together and snipping his head scissors. Right away, this small animation tells us he's someone who tries hard to intimidate his enemies. When you enter his stage, it's one of the more simplistic ones. His stage is the context in which you encounter him, and therefore has a lot to say about him. The stage itself appears to be some kind of processing facility, punctuated in two places by these machines that spit out rolling cutters at you. According to the manual, Cutman is a logging robot, and this means that, as is the case with the other Mega Man 1 Robot Masters, this is his place of work. Getting to Cutman himself, his attack pattern is as follows. He'll tend to run towards you, occasionally stopping to throw his rolling cutter. You need to either dodge him while he's running, or dodge his cutter and then shoot him, and keep in mind that he recoils every time he's hit. This means you have to be careful when trying to get around him, and ideally you want him cornered. Because of the way this boss fight is designed, it's easier to beat him with the Mega Buster than it is with his actual weakness. The Super Arm relies on the presence of Guts blocks to use, and there's only 2 in his boss room and you need both to take him down. It's not surprising he's fairly simple as a boss. Cutman is the first character highlighted when you boot the game up, therefore, usually the character most players fight first. Because the developers have this expectation that players are going to start with Cutman, both his stage and his boss fight are made simple. So, despite his threat display when you first see him, he's actually not very threatening. It's really easy to corner him and just go to town. He tries very hard, but he's not very good, and going by that simplicity, he's probably not very smart either. Therefore, this is the characterization the production team went with, a person who talks a big game but can't play one. Incidentally, I think this goes a long way to explaining his vocal performance in the show. See, voice actor Terry Klassen decided to do an impression of 40s horror actor Peter Lorre when voicing the role of Cutman. If you know anything about Peter Lorre, then you know a character like Cutman is exactly the role he was often typecast as. The impression's pretty good, too.
Open it nice and slow so I can give them haircuts from the neck up.
You will clasp your hands together at the back of your neck. I intend to search your offices, Mr. Spade. I warn you, if you attempt to prevent me, I shall certainly shoot you.
Now let's go through that same process with Gutsman to be sure we understand how to turn gameplay into characterization. His introductory animation when you pick Gutsman's stage doesn't have him do much, but we can immediately pick out that he's a big boy. The convention with a character design like this, of course, is that big means strong. His stage is fairly interesting, and has these floating platforms near the start. The jumps you have to do to get across them are precise in their timing, and if you fail, you die immediately. For Gutsman, these platforms are something of a hint both towards how you defeat him, and whose weapon he's weak to. They also suggest a degree of caution when he comes to the boss himself. In the boss battle with Gutsman, he does a short jump and the ground shakes when he lands. If you don't jump at the right time to avoid this, you're stunned for a few seconds, and in that time, Gutsman will pick up a Guts block and throw it at you. It will almost certainly hit you. This, like the platforms in his stage, tells you that you can't be careless around him. But when it comes to gameplay, that's all there really is to Gutsy. In a sense, while he is much tougher, he's also even simpler than Cutman. If we're going to equate AI complexity with intelligence, then he's three things: big, strong, and stupid. Sure enough, this is how he is in the show. He's big, he's dangerous, but he generally relies on his allies to be clever for him. He's also defined as a demolition robot in the first game's manual, rather than a construction robot as the latter half of the franchise describes him. Therefore, that he uses his power to cause destruction and harm comes naturally to him. The next character I'm going to talk about is Roll, who's a different case from both Dr. Light and the Robot Masters. The reason for this is pretty simple. She doesn't do jack in the first 6 games in the series. In fact, we don't even learn her name until Mega Man 3 during the credits. She shows up at the end of the first game, and in cutscenes of others, but in terms of actually doing anything, Roll gets nothing. She's a background extra. This means that the production team had basically free reign as to what to do with her. According to Joe Ruby, they decided to make her an action girl to attract a female audience. This decision not to just give her an active role, but the second most active role on the good guys team as Mega Man's sidekick, makes her an example of one of the most engaging parts of an adaptation in my mind, when the new context alters a character in interesting ways. Roll's character design in the cartoon is very different from her game counterparts. She's still very cute, but aside from aging her up with the boys, she has a full jumpsuit and armor instead of a red dress. Honestly, I like this design better. Don't get me wrong, I love Canon Roll, but not only does this let her be active without any, risks, but it means that she actually fits in with the Robot Masters around her rather than just looking like a normal girl. It also helps represent how she's a more involved member of the cast in this cartoon than she was in the games. Even aside from this design expressing changes made to Roll as a character, I like how it balances out her brother's design. See, a lot of hero characters tend to work on primary colors. Once color was introduced to film, most protagonists we meet are some combination of red, yellow, and blue. These 3 colors are typically associated with heroic virtues like justice, passion, and care, which is why you'll see it so often. Mega Man is pretty much just all blue, and while this is in its own way fine, it does make him a little boring to look at. Incomplete, almost. With Roll by his side in yellow and red, there's much more of a balance in color between the twins. It makes them feel like a whole when they work side by side. Rush is another story when it comes to the adaptation process. He's not directly playable, nor is he an enemy, but he does factor into gameplay as a support unit. His use as a means of transport makes him vital to Mega Man as another sidekick. There is another hitch to this as well, the fact that Rush is a robot dog rather than a humanoid as the Robot Masters are. Because we're looking at characterizing an animal, it's hard to say how you'd effectively go about it. Animals have individual personalities, absolutely, dogs especially. But because this is a support character in a video game, it's hard to derive any additional character traits beyond helpful and loyal. Rush doesn't feature in any cutscenes, and because he's pretty much a tool in gameplay, that means the gameplay is limited in implying characterization. What the production team landed on was making Rush an XP of Scooby-Doo. While I get that producers Joe Ruby and Ken Spears were the guys that came up with the concept of Scooby-Doo to begin with, no seriously, look it up, the decision to make Rush a Scooby-Doo XP does come to the cartoon's detriment in terms of quality. The comedy slapstick that revolves around Rush is largely forced and somewhat lazy. But speaking purely on the standpoint of adaptation, I wouldn't consider making Rush Scooby-Doo 2 Robotic Boogaloo a completely wrong choice. Giving Rush the ability to speak to some extent gives him the opportunity to participate more directly in the plot. There's also nothing within the games that would suggest that this is out of step with the world, or Dr. Light's particular way of building robots, even if the rest of his work consists mainly of humanoids. Now we're closing in on the big players. Proto Man, in the games, has a large role and is one of few Robot Masters, aside from the ones from Mega Man 2 if you count the Doc Robot as a second appearance on their behalf, to appear in the mainline series after their debut. His first appearance in Mega Man 3 has him, as the mysterious Breakman, show up in various other Robot Master stages to fight you, running and jumping the same way you do. As with most Robot Masters, if you're only just learning the game, you're probably going to lose your first fight to him. But whether you win or lose, you're going to be like, wait, why was there a boss fight in the middle of this stage? Who was that guy? This creates a rivalry dynamic between you as the player and him as this repeat boss who keeps teleporting away instead of letting himself be defeated by you. Your final boss fight with him is during the final gauntlet of levels leading towards Dr. Wily, and when you beat the game, he saves you before Dr. Wily's fortress can collapse on top of you. This sudden change from being your enemy to being your friend comes as a shock to the player, and is explained by the credits. He's your brother, the original Robot Master. He shows up once again to help in Mega Man 4, where he rescues the kidnapped Kalinka Cossack off screen, when you're in the middle of beating the snot out of her dad. Dr. Wily goes as far as to call him a traitor when he does this, and in Mega Man 5, Dr. Wily frames him for his latest scheme by having the Darkman impersonate Proto Man, kidnap Dr. Light, and attempt world domination. Of course. This more complex relationship with the character of Proto Man makes him stand out to the player, as the role he plays shifts and changes over the course of the series. He'd eventually rise to the level of playability and power it up, and he would continue to support Mega Man in the latter half of the mainline games. From an adaptational standpoint, characterizing Proto Man is an exercise in applying the techniques of implicit gameplay characterization we learned from Cutman and Gutsman, and the techniques of direct translation we learned from Dr. Light. Proto Man is the only character, aside from Dr. Wily, to have a fully fleshed personality in the source material that existed at the time. In talking about how he applies to gameplay, I'm going to focus on Mega Man 3, because while he features in the stories of Mega Man 4 and 5, he doesn't feature into the parts where you're hitting buttons. As I said before, he's a repeat boss. He has all the same basic abilities as Mega Man, making him somewhat similar to the copy robot fight from Mega Man 1. Except where the copy robot copied whatever the player did, and therefore could be considered less autonomous than the robot masters from before, Proto Man starts the fight immediately and with his own strategy. The immediate parallels to Mega Man contextualize the entire rest of his character. This seems to be why Proto Man is a constant rival to his brother throughout the cartoon, and is therefore presented as an obstacle he can never truly overcome, no matter how many times he wins. I will grant that in some ways, this adaptation of the character is incomplete. You don't have the redemption story fully played out. The show hints at it, and has Mega Man make the offer several times for Proto Man to become a good guy, only to be shot down every time. The closest he ever gets to reforming is in the episode Brobots, wherein his play at being a better person is a plot by Dr. Wily to catch Mega Man off guard and incapacitate him. Arguably, Proto Man is the biggest deviation between the show and the games, because of these two factors. He stays entirely in the place where his game counterparts started, never changing from that point forward. That said, this changes in service of the new format, something I'll go into further detail on shortly. But as an adaptation of the character from a specific point of the timeline, he's both extremely entertaining to watch, thanks in large part to his vocal performance by Scott McNeil, and still serves the more important function as Mega Man's rival, in the times before anyone really knew who Bass was.
The reason I'm spending so much time talking about the cast is because when you look at an adaptation, the thing you most want accuracy for is the characters. Usually the world building too, but that's more malleable, since you need an adaptation to be accessible to a regular audience. But if the characters are correct, and they're good characters, then the audience that doesn't already know them will be more invested in learning about them.
This is especially true, of course, for the main protagonist and antagonist. An audience won't put up with a hero they can't stand, and they won't be invested in a villain they don't either enjoy or fear. In particular for a villain, if you can't bring yourself to care about what evil thing they're going to do next, how are you going to stay invested in the story as a whole? The specifics of the villain are also going to say a lot about a work's tone. Their methods and their goals will dictate the intensity of the story, and the ultimate themes that the creator means to convey to the audience will have to be balanced between the hero and the villain. Dr. Wily in the games is goofy, cowardly, deeply power-hungry and jealous, but ultimately not very threatening as far as world domination-seeking bad guys go. Don't be fooled, he's very powerful. The robot masters built by him, the Mega Man 2 ones especially, are the most famously tough in the series. He's no slouch either as the final boss fight of every installment. But at the end of every game, he's either running away like a coward or begging for forgiveness. Because he's the main antagonist, we have not just indirect characterization throughout all 6 games, but direct characterization as well, in the way that he's described in the manuals. More than any other character in the franchise at that point, Dr. Wily has the most thorough characterization in the games, and therefore pretty easy to adapt to a TV show. He's petty and controlling and absolutely slimy, but he can't actually do very much without his machine to hide behind. Whenever he fails his evil schemes, he runs away to scheme another day, and scheme again he always does. That said, there are some key differences between the two versions of him. For one thing, the cartoon version of Dr. Wily isn't quite as cowardly as his original. Heck, there's a point where Mega Man has him at Buster Point, and while he does freak out a little, Dr. Wily doesn't grovel. He just cooperates, reluctantly, and eventually uses the situation to his advantage later in the episode. In this sense, he's truer to his function as a final boss than he is to his characterization as a coward. The tone that Dr. Wily sets for the cartoon is much as the same as the one set in the games. He's a supervillain who wants to take over the world, and he does it by sending his robots to do some robberies, kidnap people, sometimes threaten monuments, take over the government, steals or invents evil, terrible lasers that blow things up or move the moon out of its orbit, all kinds of wild cartoon logic-y things that somehow never saw anything so dastardly that Mega Man can't stop it while keeping everyone safe and sound. Speaking of which, it's time to talk about the Blue Bomber himself, and the challenges of adapting a video game protagonist are completely different from adapting literally anyone else in a video game story. A video game is experienced directly by the player, and the protagonist is less of a character in their own right than they are a vehicle for the audience to become a part of the story. Anything that happens to the protagonist is, in effect, happening to the player themselves, and the emotional reaction reflects accordingly. And because a lot of video game heroes, especially in the 80s and 90s, are silent protagonists, the player is inevitably going to project some amount of themselves onto that character regardless of what we're given for characterization. Some video game heroes are easier to adapt than others. For example, if you look at the Warcraft movie, the protagonists are controllable characters that happen to be the main participants in the plot. Thanks to this, the folks behind the adaptation have the benefit of translating those characters directly to film without particular concern for medium nuances that might make it trickier for a character like, say, Samus Aran or Link to make it to the big screen. Adapting a video game hero references from the source material, of course, but in a way that suits the new medium and the new story. The adaptation should properly fill in the gaps that are intentionally left by the game. For example, consider the character of Tim Goodman in Detective Pikachu, originally a bit more of a blank slate, given a full character arc and hero's journey in the film. Mega Man in the games, at least by 1994, had little characterization outside of gameplay. He was a hero, pointedly of his own choice, and wanted the same world peace that his creator wanted to build. He's contemplative, implied by the way that the credits of 1, 2, and 3 are set up, and while he is unhesitant about being a hero, the way he removes his armor in the credits of Mega Man 1 and his helmet in Mega Man 2 suggests that he fights for peace so that he never has to fight again.
Talking about indirect characterization given by gameplay is a lot trickier for a playable character than for any other. We're no longer talking about enemy AI or function in gameplay, we're talking about how the player themselves interacts with the game, something that's very specific to an individual's experience rather than something that can be judged objectively. The best that one can do in creating an adaptation is to interpret the ways that gameplay leads the player to make certain decisions, or the way that certain actions that the player must take, or is likely to take, affects the rest of the game, and incorporate that into the adaptation.
Mega Man as a video game series is based a lot on trial and error in its gameplay. This is true of practically all video games of the time, but it's practically impossible for a first-time player to get through a whole playthrough of any given Mega Man game without dying at least a handful of times. This is why a lot of older games even have a life system to begin with, because the player is expected to fail, learn from that failure, and do better next time. This is very much the case with the cartoon as well. I'll go into more detail on this later, but every episode is framed around a series of failures and successes on Mega Man's part throughout. Each time he fails, he has to pull back, understand what went wrong, and correct for it in his next attempt. It's also expected in the context of a Mega Man game that the player will learn to strategize as they learn the ins and outs of the game. For example, it's very possible that in your first attempt or two at playing Mega Man 1, that you might miss the Magnet Beam in Electman stage because you ended up doing that stage before getting the Super Arm from Gutsman. So on that playthrough, you'll have to do the stage twice just to get the Magnet Beam, but by the third time, a player will have learned to do Gutsman's stage before Electman's so that they can pick it up and get through the rest of the game more easily. This aspect of being a strategist is something we see of Mega Man in the cartoon. Between successes and failures, Mega Man tends to confer with his sister and/or creator as to what to do next, trying to predict Dr. Wily's next move and account for it. Depending on the episode, he also may make a preemptive move, such as in Brainbot when he manages to disguise himself so that he's kidnapped instead, and he attempts to take down Dr. Wily's goons on his own while his sister finishes escorting Brainbot to the lab he is to be delivered to. In terms of filling in the characterization gaps left by the game, Mega Man is presented to us as a cool, self-assured, seasoned hero. He's protective and kind to others, refuses to harm humans that aren't Dr. Wily, and isn't too proud to admit when he's failed or needs help. He does start out with a bit of a sexist streak that he grows out of by episode 5, and from then on he's effectively a relatable role model for young boys to want to become. This, of course, suits the story that's being told. It's a superhero story. We want our heroes to be good people. And the fact that Mega Man can both rise and fall lets us know that he isn't infallible, and that it's okay to lose sometimes, just as long as you pick yourself back up and try again.
With all that said, I'd like to move on to talking about the structure of the cartoon. I touched on it already when it came to how they shaped the cartoon around the video game, but I want to go into more detail on that because the structure of the show is the framework on which everything else is laid.
Like any superhero show, or really cartoon in general, Mega Man follows an episodic structure. In every episode, Dr. Wily comes up with a scheme, often relating to a new invention, discovery, or change in the day-to-day lives of the main characters. As he begins to put his plan into motion, Mega Man, Roll, and Rush discover his work and begin trying to stop him. We'll be introduced to 1, 2, sometimes 3 or more Robot Masters who will join the bad guys team for that episode, whose powers will eventually be vital to Mega Man to stopping Dr. Wily and saving the day. There are no multi-part episodes in the series. Even the start of the show compresses its backstory and establishes its status quo within just the one episode, before launching right into regular Scheme of the Week plotlines. There's also no overarching plot, the characters, generally speaking, are static, and there's no greater secret scheme for Wily to cap off a season with, or even the series with, and anything that happens in a particular episode is never mentioned outside of that episode. It's also interesting that this choice was made, given that there are certainly episodes that could have used the extra runtime to make their stories bigger. Robots is an episode about Proto Man manipulating his way into his Good Shoes family's life, and while Mega Man is genuinely hurt by his ultimate betrayal, the episode makes it clear that deep in Proto Man's System 32 folder, he truly, honestly wants to be closer to Mega Man than he can ever be while they're on opposite sides. Having more time to explore the drama for both brothers would have done a lot to make the story more emotional for the viewer in turn. There's also The Day the Moon Fell, which has the most devastating and dangerous plot that Dr. Wily ever puts into motion. Literally tearing the moon out of its orbit and blackmailing the whole planet that he'll only put it back if they cede control over to him. This plan is so evil that even his Robot Masters are freaked out about it, even though they obey him. And having more time to explore the utter worldwide destruction that would take place before Mega Man manages to save the day would do a lot to ratchet up the tension. This decision to never have a bigger story explains a lot about the changes made to the characters. Dr. Light has already made a world with humans and robots a reality, and is less inclined to forgive Dr. Wily's transgressions, because having either quality would obligate a long narrative that focuses on either him trying to create the world he wants, or trying to reform his ex-partner. And to be fair, Dr. Light constantly extending an olive branch to Dr. Wily would be repetitive, given Proto Man and Mega Man's relationship. Proto Man doesn't have a redemption arc of his own, because then you have to explore that arc of him inching towards the decision to leave Dr. Wily's side and take Mega Man's, and then devote an episode to having it happen and change the status quo irreparably for the show. And Dr. Wily doesn't grovel, because then you'd have him in and out of prison, redemption, false redemption, etc. These changes ultimately were made for the sake of a simplified adaptation. Mind you, the writers behind Mega Man are masters of pacing. No episode ever feels like it drags, the story never meanders, and it never moves too quickly either. Because they keep to a tight formula, every plot beat is well-timed and well-placed without ever feeling like you're watching the same episode twice, even when Dr. Wily's plans are similar to a previous episode. Also, with every story as a standalone, then you don't have to worry about watching the show out of order. If you skip an episode or two, you won't have missed anything, and you won't be confused for the next episode you tune into. You could start right in the middle of the second season and be able to grasp what's going on without too much trouble. This also means that if you have a short attention span like I do, and you sit down to watch an episode, then you can just watch one episode and be perfectly satisfied. You never get left on a cliffhanger or a to be continued, because every episode has a neatly packaged ending. So the choice to keep to a single narrative per episode without interweaving them was well done and, for logistical reasons, appropriate. Moving on, one of the most important aspects of adaptation is its quality as a new piece of media. So while we set up the parts that are going into the product through their translation and alteration from game to cartoon, it's also important to talk about how these concepts are actually utilized within the show itself, divorced from the games that it's based on. Mega Man as a show is not something that intends to speak to the human condition or make any grand sweeping statements about our future or the politics of the day. And honestly, that's fine. There's value in a piece of media that allows its audience to just shut their brains off and enjoy the ride. That said, there is one major overarching theme within the cartoon, because, as I said before, one of the most important defining aspects of an entire show will be the conflict of ideology between the hero and the villain. And even if it's a very simple dichotomy of good versus evil, as is mostly the case here, it's good to spice things up with some kind of philosophical intrigue. See, there are some inherent implications to the idea of a robot being tasked to fight other robots. We take it for granted that whatever we're told to fight in a video game probably deserves it, whether what we're fighting is a monster, another human, a god, or a robot. But in the case of Mega Man, we're explicitly told that these robots have been reprogrammed to do evil. So, do they deserve it? Do they even have a choice? The biggest and most consistent theme throughout the show is the question of the personhood of robots. Dr. Wily's stance on the matter is stated outright on various occasions. To him, robots are tools for his use, and nothing more.
Humans are imperfect. Robots are so much superior. My robots will be made to supervise mankind under my command.
As a result, all his robot masters are programmed to obey him. While Mega Man never outright calls himself a person, if anything he has the concern that he isn't, and I'll get to that, it's made very clear by his actions and his plans that he's entirely free-willed, obedient only by his own choice. In episode 1, before he's even reprogrammed into Mega Man, Rock is able to lie to Dr. Wily, something that Dr. Wily claims is impossible for robots to do. We can also see multiple times that he's not bound strictly to whatever Dr. Light tells him to do, as whenever Dr. Light is brainwashed or otherwise not in his right mind, Mega Man doesn't have to obey his will. He can incapacitate Dr. Light as needed in order to save the day. He can choose whether or not to risk the lives of humans. He can refuse to shoot an innocent like Mr. Zero, but gladly shove his buster in Dr. Wily's face. While Robot Masters are programmed to be inclined towards specific behaviors and the demands of their creator, they are capable of disobedience or outright betrayal. Remember, Robot Masters are built on the foundation set by the famously rebellious Proto Man, and in the cartoon, he makes it clear on numerous occasions that he doesn't have to do anything Wily says.
You remember I built you, Proto Man, and you will obey me.
You're right, Dr. Wily. I'll obey you when I want to.
This is implied to be true for everyone else under Dr. Wily's command as well, given the right incentive. In Ice Age, Iceman is tricked into believing that Dr. Wily has abandoned him in favor of Airman. Out of jealous rage, Iceman demands that Dr. Light build him an army, and he goes on to take that army and try to overthrow Dr. Wily. But the most coherent and explicit exploration of the matters of robotics and personhood is Episode 3, Mega Pinocchio. Mega Pinocchio is an episode about Mega Man's existential discomfort with being a robot. A very human-like robot, but ultimately just a robot. He meets a man named Dr.
Petto.
Okay, his name, to be clear, is Dr. Petto, as in Geppetto, but if you say it too quickly, the character's name comes off as concerning.
So Mega Man meets Dr. Pedophile and learns that he's a scientist studying a means to turn robots into humans. After mulling over the idea for a while, Mega Man ultimately goes to get the procedure done in secret, and that's when we learn that this is a trap set up by Dr. Wily to brainwash Mega Man to his side. The episode takes the plot slowly by not having Mega Man be immediately totally under Dr. Wily's control, to give the episode more time to explore Mega Man's uncertainties between being a robot and being a human. He believes he has been turned human throughout the bulk of the episode, and a lot of the tension between his human and robotic sides is, ultimately, the tension between the will of someone else and his honest feelings, respectively. After all, we know Mega Man isn't really human now. He's a robot, as he's always been, and the personal issue that he's dealing with is well explored and even heartfelt. There's a particular moment after Dr. Wily makes him screw up stopping his robot masters, and he and Dr. Light are talking about it later. Here's that scene because I don't think description beyond context will quite do it justice.
I guess I let you down, Doc.
Don't blame yourself, Mega. Failure is a human quality, but we humans learn from our mistakes.
Am I one of your mistakes?
Oh, why, of course not. You'll always be special to me, Mega.
Oh god, Rock, you poor baby.
The episode's climax with Mega Man fully under Dr. Wily's control, only to be able to break free with the help of his family, is also very revealing as to the true nature of robotics in this universe. I know everyone loves dunking on this bit.
Oh no! He's gonna blast President Lincoln!
But to be clear, that weird moment of awkwardly placed, kind of hilarious patriotism reveals the actual nature of Mega Man, that he is a person with autonomous thoughts and feelings regardless of his programming. Ultimately, the show takes that position. Robots are people and should be treated as such. The show also explores themes like familial relationships, good and bad, the relationship between the present and future, science versus magic, and a few other blips of meaning scattered across the series. It's not built for an extensive analysis and doesn't focus on any of these ideas in as much detail as Mega Pinocchio, but again, it doesn't need to. Other adaptations later would look into these themes more extensively, but as far as an action-focused series aimed at 90s American kids goes, the show handles these ideas acceptably. As with most cartoons of this time, Mega Man had a small grab bag of episode writers, one of whom would write a script and get it approved to be made into an episode. For a series like this, particularly one with no overarching narrative, there are a few things that are going to rise to importance above other aspects of the writing. After all, different stories have different needs, and things that are vital to one property might be inconsequential to another. The reason this video is so character-focused is because Mega Man as a franchise is defined by its massive cast of colorful characters. Every game is built specifically around the robot masters that feature in it. because not only are these characters bosses, but their main abilities become another weapon in the player's arsenal after they're defeated, and therefore have to be accounted for in every level. The main purpose of the game's stories is to give context to those characters, above progressing any larger narrative. The Mega Man games are, therefore, entirely built around their cast. As with Cutman and Gutsman, however, most of the characterization of the Robot Masters had to be derived from gameplay near exclusively, because nothing else existed yet to help inform their personalities or personal interests. As such, we run into the problem of samey characterization. Consider Episode 7, 2000 Leagues Under the Sea. Dive Man and Wave Man both feature in this episode as its villains, but there's virtually no distinction between them as characters. They're both, at best, a variation on Gutsman's personality, big, strong, and stupid, and it's even harder to tell them apart because these are two water-based robot masters with hefty builds and blue armor. Bomb Man appears in multiple episodes, being one of the go-to robot masters for the writers. That makes sense. Being one of the Mega Man 1 guys, he's one of the most recognizable to people who've played the games. However, outside of his particular penchant for blowing stuff up, a trait itself pretty indistinguishable from anyone else's love of their particular weapon gimmick, there's nothing that sets him apart from the other Robot Masters. If you swapped him out in any given episode with Crash Man or Napalm Man, it would change virtually nothing else in the script. This isn't true of all the Robot Masters we meet, of course. Some, like Chop Man and Campus Commandos, are particularly noteworthy in their characterization. The cartoon version of Pharaoh Man is easily one of the franchise favorites, for being particularly awesome and competent compared to the others. In this way, I also want to shout out to Snake Man in Bot Transfer. While he's mostly the same as everyone else in most of the episodes he shows up in, just with a snaky lisp, in Bot Transfer, he proves to be actually pretty effective as a manipulator and actor when he switches bodies with Mega Man. It's a nice twist to make the character more memorable beyond the voice work. Because of the greater trend, however, the secondary villains of the show are somewhat the weak link of it. Episodic sidekicks Mega Man picks up tend to be much more interesting, such as Tina in Mega Man on the Moon, an astronaut's daughter who's both resourceful and determined, or, quite famously, Mega Man X, who presents an alternative ideal of heroism to Mega Man's. The show also benefits from its core cast being strongly written consistently throughout. Even in bad episodes, they tend to carry the show. They're well characterized and likable enough that a nonsensical or bizarre plot is usually salvaged by the way the characters interact with it or throughout it. The show relies heavily on the strategic intelligence of the characters, or even lack thereof depending on the characters in question. Often, both sides will have to account for where they've made a tactical mistake or outright screwed up. In this way, while the ending is always guaranteed to have Mega Man save the day, the path on how he does it is always engaging and unpredictable. It also helps that these characters are motivated. Because the show is based on responding to whatever the other side is up to, both the heroes and the villains are constantly making active decisions, which helps the audience stay engaged with the story's push and pull. Each episode's plot tends to be the glue between the various action scenes. After the initial inciting incident, the story scenes will consist of strategizing amongst the heroes and/or villains, info gathering, or relationship development. While the initial concepts can be silly, often nonsensical or unscientific for a sci-fi show, those concepts tend to be the excuse to make the action scenes happen. For example, in the episode Night of the Living Monster Bots, there's no reasonable explanation for how being bitten by a robot werewolf turns Dr. Light into an actual werewolf, but it presents a scenario where Mega Man has to figure out a way to neutralize Dr. Light without actually hurting him. Robots physically entering people's dreams and Mega Dreams makes no sense, but it gives us a cool climax of Mega Man fighting the Wily Bots in a medieval-esque dreamscape to save the day. Because of this, the action tends to be the parts of the show that are given the most weight and emphasis. The animation quality fluctuates, which is pretty common for shows of this time, but the choreography is generally solid and easy to follow. The viewer is rarely put into a position where they don't know where the characters are in relation to one another, or where it's hard to tell who's doing what. The action set pieces themselves are also impressively varied. You get your standard fights, but the show also has car chases, daring escapes, infiltrating the enemy base, handling disaster situations, robberies, kidnappings, and each one is unique enough that you'll never mix up which action scene is in which episode. The lighting and the variants of included Robot Masters, and thus available abilities on either side, makes each action scene, and therefore each episode, distinct. That said, I think the strongest moments of each episode are its tactical moments, where each side is figuring out what they should do next. Not only do these scenes provide a great chance for the audience to catch their breath, but it's often where the intellect of the characters shine the brightest. The planning is easy to follow. Even in really weird episodes, you won't tend to get any drastic leaps in logic. Lion Men are taking over the world, and they turn any humans they come across into more Lion Men. Fight back with the robots. Oh no, they've reprogrammed the robots. Reprogram some back and figure out the leader's weakness. But these scenes are also where you get the meatiest character interaction, including the development of Mega Man and Royal's partnership as hero and sidekick, Proto Man being sarcastic and sassy with Dr. Wily, and sometimes even some unique interactions amongst the other Wily bots. In all, outside of some oddness, the writing in this cartoon is very solid. As a show on its own, and as an adaptation, it's a great piece of media that deserves recognition for more than its most awkward moments.
Thank you for joining me in my first video. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please be sensible in the comments. I'd appreciate it greatly if you'd subscribe, hit the bell, like and share this video around.
Thank you so much to UltraPrimal and Zackari Grief for helping me with my script. And thank you to the folks who subscribed to me ahead of time.
And if you're interested in commenting, tell me what you think of the 1994 Mega Man cartoon. And tell me what you consider the most important aspect of a video game adaptation. With all that, I'm Jay on Channel 3. Thanks for playing.